Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we dive into the question of whether Russia knew that the deadly ISIS-K attack in Moscow was coming, and whether the Kremlin might try to use that attack to its advantage. We've got excerpts from an interview with Ethan Tu, the founder of Taiwan AI Labs, a private research organization leading the way in how futuristic generative AI tools can be used to identify disinformation in the global media space. We'll also hear from former National Security Agency General Counsel Stuart Baker on whether a global organization overseeing how AI is used by different countries around the world is a good idea. And we'll give our take on whether we're witnessing a permanent shift in the U.S. Israel relationship. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status podcast. Thank you all so much for joining us this week. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Guy, we've got a lot to get to this week and a couple of great excerpts from some interviews that you did last week. But first things first, what's on your radar right now?
Hey, Ben. Great to be here as always. A couple things that kind of jumped out at me this week that I think are worth highlighting. One is how former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, in a speech, I think it was at Columbia University, it was an Aspen Institute event in New York last week, she suddenly started talking about deep fake videos. She said that America's adversaries are toying with new artificial intelligence tools to generate content resembling her that can dupe unwitting audiences as part of an effort to meddle in global politics. I thought this is pretty interesting because we're going to get into the deepfake issue and disinformation by foreign adversaries throughout this week's episode. Hillary Clinton may have been talking off the cuff. It's hard to tell exactly what she was referring to, but intelligence sources have been warning, and we've been reporting on this, about deep fake videos and disinformation online for months, years, really, since deepfake began penetrating social media sites. If some listener, for some reason, doesn't know what a deepfake video is, it's basically a computer-generated video that's not real. It could be me. It looks just like me. It's my voice. We've seen examples of this on the information landscape around the world. Probably the most prominent in the last year or so were Russian deepfake videos showing Ukrainian military officers making claims about the war that were completely untrue. Things like that.
You know, Guy, one thing, just to not to interrupt, but just one thing about deepfakes that I've been wondering about is I wonder if actually we've done a fairly good job as the United States and generally the global community. It seems like the alarm bells were sounded pretty early on that this was coming. And I think a lot of us were afraid that there would be just this rash of deepfake videos that duped everybody and there was mass panic about what people are saying, what's happening. That hasn't really happened yet, has it?
I don't think we've had one incident that's had a massive national security implication. However, it is notable that Hillary Clinton brought it up and made headlines about it in New York last week. A second thing, Ben, just to switch topics on you, that I want to highlight was this call from a Foundation for Defense of Democracy's report last week for the creation of a dedicated U.S. military cyber force to stand alongside the Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines, and Space Force, the Pentagon's other military services. Whether that comes to the fore, a cyber force, is hard to foresee right now, but the fact that it's openly being talked about now in Washington is pretty interesting, given that we hear constant warnings from lawmakers and U.S. intelligence officials in congressional testimony about the rising threat of cyber attacks by foreign adversaries, state actors or non-state actors. And there's a lot of focus on China and China-backed hackers infiltrating U.S. critical infrastructure with so-called living off the land tactics. It's noteworthy that the U.S. federal government last week, working with European partners, imposed a slate of economic sanctions on a Chinese company linked to Beijing's Ministry of State Security spy service. These sanctions accuse that company of conducting cyber attacks against critical U.S. infrastructure. As part of that development, the Justice Department indicted 7 Chinese state-linked hackers who were charged in U.S. federal court with targeting senior U.S. officials, including at the White House and in the Senate, along with critics of the Chinese Communist Party. This is interesting. Of course, these individuals aren't arrested, but it's really just the federal government calling out the threat, and in the latest example of how big of a space this is occupying in the national security discussion.
The idea of a cyber force is fascinating just from a historical point of view, of course, too. We had the Air Force created in 1947, and then we went from 1947 until the Trump administration, 2018, 2019, when the Space Force was officially stood up. The idea of a cyber force, again, now, if we were to actually get that in the next few years, that would mark 2 new military services in under a decade, which would be pretty remarkable from a historical point of view. Guy, I want to dive into the aftermath of the ISIS-K attack in Moscow 2 weeks ago, which we covered briefly on last week's episode, but there's been a lot of new detail that's come out in the days since then. And I want to drill down on one specific aspect that's really caught my attention here, and that's the question of whether Vladimir Putin and other top officials in the Kremlin either knew about this attack and chose to let it go ahead, or if perhaps there was just some massive incompetence inside the Russian military and its security services. Now, look, I understand some of this might sound a bit conspiratorial. We try to keep things, very solidly, fact-based here in the Threat Status podcast. So we certainly can't say with any degree of certainty that Russia intentionally let this attack happen, but there's a few things worth considering. First, on March 8th, the U.S. Embassy in Moscow explicitly and publicly in a public press release and on social media warned of a possible terror attack in Moscow and specifically mentioned concerts as a possible target. Secondly, Russia tried to blame this on Ukraine and said that some of the attackers were trying to flee to Ukraine afterwards. In reality, according to President Lukashenko of Belarus, they actually headed toward Belarus, and then they were cut off because the border was closed, and then they headed to Ukraine. Was that by design? Was there a plan to try and funnel them to Ukraine so Russia could use that as a pretext in some way?
You pointed to the March 8th U.S. Embassy Moscow alert. That was actually one day after U.S. Army General Michael Kurilla, the head of U.S. Central Command, was testifying on Capitol Hill in Washington, where he basically sounded the alarm that Islamic State Khorasan operatives, this is ISIS-K, in Afghanistan and Syria, have capability and will to launch strikes pretty much at any time with little to no warning, external attacks targeting European assets or possibly U.S. forces somewhere in Europe. So I bring this up because there's been a lot of this Kremlinology and speculation about what did the Russians know? Did the Americans share intel on ISIS-K with them? But the fact that the Central Command commander was publicly warning that ISIS-K may have an attack. If for those of us that go back to the 9/11 era and talking about what used to just be called chatter, that when an intelligence chatter gets picked up and moves to a level that it gets talked about by the head of U.S. Central Command in public, there's no question whether the Russians saw that testimony, analyzed it, probably had access to the same intelligence.
And it's worth keeping in mind, of course, Nathan Sales, who I know you know as well, Guy, the former State Department counterterrorism coordinator under President Trump. He told me recently that he believes the U.S. is being cautious about how much intelligence it shares with Russia about ISIS-K because there's fear that Putin might try to use quote unquote counterterrorism actions as a way to pursue his own interests, just as he moved into Syria. Look, it's clear we've seen Putin many times. He's willing to kill civilians, or allegedly at least kill civilians. He blew up or is believed to have blown up a jet carrying Yevgeny Prigozhin last August, the head of the Wagner Group, who led a brief rebellion last summer against Putin. 10 people were killed in that flight, including innocent members of the flight crew. Now, Putin denies involvement. We should stress that, but most people believe he most likely was involved. So that leads to the question of, is there an interest that Russia believes it could achieve with this terror attack. One could be the Ukraine pretext that we just talked about. But here's another guy that I think is perhaps even more interesting. Last week, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov criticized Telegram specifically and said, quote, the app is increasingly becoming a tool in the hands of terrorists being used for terrorist purposes. Now, Telegram has been used extensively by pro-Ukraine outfits, by the Ukrainian military. It's been sort of a hub of a lot of that videos, pictures of Ukrainian successes early in the war. Now, it's hard for Russia to try and shut down Telegram, but could they try to take steps to restrict its access? Could they launch cyber attacks, hacking operations? Do you think that's reasonable to wonder, Guy?
I do. Absolutely, Ben. I think the use and manipulation control of social media platforms by autocratic powers, whether it's Russia, Iran, or China, or other smaller governments, to countries across parts of Africa, even some in Latin America, Venezuela. This is a major theme in any discussion about how information and disinformation wars are being waged right now in 2024. And then when you factor in the artificial intelligence aspect and the use of generative AI by adversarial intelligence agencies, things become very murky very quickly on the global information landscape. How are narratives formed about a particular incident, be it a war like the Israel-Hamas war or the Russian invasion and occupation of Ukraine, or a terrorist attack like the alleged ISIS-K attack in Moscow. So you could be talking about opposition forces, extremist terrorist groups using secretive social media platform to communicate with each other, or you could be talking about a government seizing on a narrative to crack down on a channel for opposition. This has actually been a good segue point into our interview section this week. I actually sat down with the head of an organization that's wedged itself over the past couple of years right into the center of that murky space. I interviewed Ethan Tu, the founder of Taiwan AI Labs, a private foundation based in Taipei that specializes in harnessing new AI tools to canvas social media platforms in multiple languages around the world in search of disinformation that's being spread on those platforms by autocratic powers using what Taiwan AI Labs calls armies of trolls on the disinformation battlefield. Being in Taipei, Ethan Tu and Taiwan AI Labs were scrambling during the lead up and really throughout the recent Taiwanese presidential elections in January, identifying what they say was the spread of disinformation about the candidates in the election, as well as various false narratives about Taiwanese democracy, all pushed by what Taiwan AI Labs says were AI trolls controlled by the Communist Party-run government in mainland China to sow discord in Taiwan around the election and really to undermine public trust in democracy in Taiwan. Let's go to some of the excerpts of that interview. Ethan Tu, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. As I understand it, Taiwan AI Labs is really sitting at the heart of the information war, tracking disinformation being pushed by the Communist Party-ruled government in mainland China. Your foundation is pioneering the use of generative AI as a tool to track disinformation. What can you tell me about the disinformation space right now with regard to artificial intelligence?
So in Taiwan, starting in year 2018, we see a lot of information manipulation on the social media. But later on, we found the information manipulation become more diverse. It's harder to identify if this account is fake or not, if this information is being manipulated or not after we have generative AI. Because the generative AI can write the same narrative in a very diverse way. At the same time, the user profile looks pretty authentic, although they are being generated.
So essentially fake users on social media.
Fake users, fake profile, fake image, and also fake video following the same narratives.
Is it China that is the driving force of using AI to spread disinformation?
When we look into this content and the way how it spread looks like the biggest beneficial party is actually China in Taiwan. So we believe there's a great interest in China leveraging the new technology to manipulate the information space and the social media.
Promoting narratives about the rest of the world or specifically about the China-Taiwan relationship?
I would say that's very interesting. We see the central account group that is not the authentic users using the Mandarin to try to manipulate the narratives in Taiwan, but at the same time they also speak English and go to following United States news media and post in English, try to misleading United States audience. That we see this kind of manipulation.
Taiwan AI Labs has, in the past few weeks, put out a report identifying troll armies moving across social media in various platforms, in various languages, not just spreading disinformation about China's posture towards Taiwan or anti-Taiwanese narratives, but also a disinformation about international conflicts within Europe, Russia's war in Ukraine, information about Germany, Lithuania, Sweden. This report talked about the arrest of a Japanese crime boss involved in an attempt to allegedly smuggle nuclear materials to Iran. This is disinformation. And also information about the Israel-Hamas conflict, China's diplomatic footprint around the world. How is it that AI is being used to detect these troll armies?
In Taiwan AI Lab, we also build out our own large language model. Then we use this large language model to look into the social media's behavior to identify which account is an authentic user and which account we think they are inauthentic users.
Let's talk about where this is going in the future. Taiwan AI Labs has done some work on identifying deep fake video and the use of generative AI to spread deep fake videos. In the last week, we've had fears expressed by Hillary Clinton in the United States about the prospect that Russia could use an AI clone of her to meddle in the coming U.S. 2024 presidential election. Where are we going in terms of the spread of fake video on the internet? Is it getting worse? And are adversarial powers in the world seizing on this opportunity?
So I would say it will definitely happen because right now using the technology to deepfake a person is so easy and so dirt cheap. It's not like a very difficult job. Even the intern student can do it. And the purpose of producing those videos is try to destroy the trustworthy environment. The trust for your leadership, the trust for your society, the trust to your friendship, the trust between Taiwan United States relationship.
There has been talk at the United Nations about the prospect of some kind of a global body like, say, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to create some sort of an agency like that to oversee rules regarding how governments can use AI. Would you support that type of an international organization? Where do you stand on that?
I support the international effort to look into the risk of the artificial intelligence. May not necessarily equal to the nuclear weapon, but it's there. So there should be an international effort to do the risk assessment. If you rely on this artificial intelligence, what will be the future looks like? And you need to have the worst case scenario. Maybe this technology looks pretty cool right now, but maybe it's pretty dangerous to human beings.
Ethan Tu, thank you so much for joining us on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thank you.
Well, Ben, I also was particularly interested in what Ethan too had to say about whether or not there should or could be some sort of international body, perhaps something tied to the United Nations, that acts something like the IAEA, that's the UN nuclear watchdog, that sets up international standards or rules or guideposts that countries around the world must adhere to in how they use artificial intelligence, whether it's in the weapons development space or the disinformation space or in health sciences and so on. This notion of such an international body has really, in recent months, seen the European Union push through the world's first comprehensive AI law. That AI law in the EU underscores the need for countries to take a so-called risk-based approach, promoting awareness about the risk of misuse of AI tools by private companies and by governments. The law also sets limits on the use of biometric identification systems by law enforcement across the EU. It also bans what's called social scoring by AI tools. It also creates pathways for individual consumers to launch complaints to their governments with regard to potentially dangerous misuses of AI. Now, debate over this is heated in the United States, of course, where some influential players warn that the government should not be controlling the AI marketplace because doing so could hinder free market ingenuity, but also because of concerns about censorship. I recently got into this, Ben, with Stuart Baker, the former general counsel of the NSA, during a threat status influencers video interview. Stuart Baker had an interesting take. Let's play that clip. I want to ask you about something that the UN Secretary General said at the UN General Assembly in September about how it doesn't matter which part of the world we're in. We could be talking about Russia, we could be talking about China, the United States, great power competition, but that global governments should be considering something like an IAEA body to set up some guideposts and the contours of international law to control how AI gets used, what applications it can have, and what types of research can be done with it. Do you think that that's a good idea? Is that necessary?
In principle, I can imagine that there would be some useful international regulation in this area, but I can't imagine the countries that we deal with actually approving a useful regulatory approach.
This Chinese is a problem at the United Nations.
Exactly. To ask the UN how would you like to regulate AI would be asking the undemocratic leaders of 3/4 of the world, what would you like AI to do to control your population? And so I think for Americans, it's just not a good idea to have an international regulation without a lot of careful thought. And even inside the U.S., you're increasing the authority of the U.S. government over the content of AI products. And, we've had now years of federal government agencies going to Silicon Valley and saying, don't let people say this. Don't let them say that. It's all contrary to the narrative of the power of the people in power, and we don't want that to happen. And Silicon Valley has been way too comfortable saying, "Okay, sure, we'll do that." And we saw recently, Google produced a whole bunch of its new AI Gemini product is totally in bed with woke ideology. So I think we want to be careful about having government acquire powers that would allow it to jawbone Silicon Valley into producing content that fits with government narratives.
Guy, I want to turn briefly to Israel and Gaza because there seems to have been, a significant, maybe somewhat subtle, but definitely a significant shift by the Biden administration here. At the United Nations last week, the U.S. abstained from a vote on a resolution in the UN Security Council calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Now, the U.S. has traditionally, blocked a lot of resolutions condemning Israel and in a lot of ways has been pretty much a pro-Israel bulwark on the UN Security Council for a long time. But now the Biden administration, as we've discussed before here in the show, is getting pretty frustrated, openly so, with the Netanyahu government in Israel. And Biden's got pressure on his left wing politically with the election coming from pro-Palestinian folks in the U.S. In fact, his big event, you mentioned Hillary Clinton earlier, Biden's big event with former President Bill Clinton was interrupted briefly by pro-Palestinian protesters last week. The Biden-Netanyahu relationship at this point seems like it might be beyond repair, and we're headed into uncharted territory here if Israel moves ahead with its assault on the city of Rafah in Gaza, where it says thousands of Hamas terrorists are still holed up. So if it goes ahead with that assault, how does this end, Guy? Are we seeing a major shift in U.S. Israel relations, or do things more or less go back to normal if and when the operation in Gaza ends, or if we get a new U.S. president, or for that matter, a new Israeli prime minister?
The politics inside Israel are something that are not always being paid very much attention to within the context of the Israel-Hamas war. But I have certainly noticed more and more biographical accounts of Benjamin Netanyahu's political career in the American media in the last 10 days. I usually read that as an indication that there are many who see the writing on the wall, that this could potentially be the end of Benjamin Netanyahu's current hold on the prime ministership. I'm not going to make a prediction to that, but I do think that there's a lot of contention right now.
And it's now time for Threats of the Week. This is a segment where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here domestically at home or in some corner of the world that we think is threatening you, the listeners right now, the American people. And my threat of the week, Guy, is sleep deprivation, and not among your two co-hosts here in the show, but I'm talking about sleep deprivation in the ranks of the U.S. military. The Government Accountability Office had a pretty alarming report last week about serious problems with both the quantity and quality of sleep that U.S. troops are getting right now. And we don't have time to go into all the dangers associated with those issues, but briefly, here's a few. The National Institutes of Health say sleep deprivation and sleep deficiency can give you, quote, trouble learning, focusing, reacting. You might find it hard to judge people's emotions and reactions, can make you feel frustrated, cranky, worried in social situations, any number of other things. But the GAO found a sizable majority of U.S. service members get 6 or fewer hours of sleep each night, less than the minimum recommended by the Defense Department. It found that only 1/3 of troops say they sleep at least 7 hours per night. The problem seems to be as much about quality as quantity. The GAO asked a sample of military officers how much they sleep and how they would describe it. 67% said they get 6 to 7 hours of sleep per night, and another 7% said they get 8 hours or more, but only half described their sleep as good, and the other half described it as poor. So we've got a problem here, Guy, and the Pentagon and military services know it. They've encouraged troops to take naps whenever they can, and they've instituted a host of other initiatives to try to get, fighting men and women more sleep. But as this GAO report proves, Guy, a lack of sleep right now could constitute a threat to U.S. military readiness.
Interesting, Ben. I've got a different one that goes along the theme of a lot of what we talked about in this week's episode, and that is the threat of disinformation spreading online via social media. We could be talking about deep fake videos. We could be talking about troll armies backed by autocratic powers like Russia and China. This is not a new threat. What's interesting and emerging about it is the intersection between this threat and generative artificial intelligence. We don't know how bad it's going to get, and we're all kind of waiting to wake up and find a narrative spreading through the mainstream media that's just simply not true, that has something to do with national security. I do want to point out that in January, the U.S. State Department announced a so-called framework to counter foreign state information manipulation. The framework to counter foreign state information manipulation. You could Google it and come up with this framework, which is certainly interesting, like a public shot across the bow on this issue, an opening salvo, but it's really not a clear way forward to countering what is my threat of the week, which is the threat of disinformation spreading online via social media.
And much like a lot of your other recent threats, guys, cyber attacks, AI, disinformation, these are themes that are going to be front and center here on the Threat Status Podcast as we move forward. So thank you all so much for listening this week. Guy, thank you very much. It's been a great episode. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with the Threat Status Podcast.